Pardon the limp, but if I've been doing this for 42 years, you can guess how old I am. Welcome. So when I started thinking about this program, something struck me I don't think I'd realized, and that is how long and how passionate have been all these issues about education in our national life. School segregation in the 1950s, busing for racial balance that roiled Boston and other cities in the late 60s and 70s, affirmative action debates that still go on to this day, the COVID pandemic and how schools did and did not respond, what should be in the textbooks and the school libraries our kids read, that has actually determined at least one political election. And now we have a new administration that is literally proposing to shut down the Department of Education. And what overlays so many of these questions, I think, is a central one. Where do our children go to school, and who decides? For the last several decades, a school choice movement has reshaped what was once something of a national consensus, I think. If you were privileged and rich, your kids would go to private school. If you were deeply religious, they would go to parochial school or yeshiva. The rest of us went to the public school in our neighborhood. And now in many, if not most states, in one form or another, varieties of school choice programs have emerged. Charter schools, school vouchers, tax money used for educational savings accounts, and the questions keep going. Do they open doors of opportunity? Do they drain public schools of resources? Do they actually produce better results? And to sift through these questions, we are really lucky to have two exceptional participants in this debate. Luis Huerta is a professor at Teachers College at Columbia. He is the author of numerous papers and books, and you can get some sense of where he stands when you realize one of his most recent works was The School Voucher Illusion. Welcome, Professor Huerta. Thanks, Jeff. You have a cheering section, all right. Robert Pondiscio, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and like Professor Huerta, he has spent much of his life studying the performance of our schools. And his views might possibly be summarized by a just published paper called The Last Days of Public Schools. So, welcome both of you. Thank you. So this is a fairly structured process, and we begin with giving each of these gentlemen 3 minutes for their, what might be called executive summary views of the central question that we're asking today. Basically, should we be moving toward more school choice for parents and children? Who's up first?
I'm first.
Professor Huerta.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks for the 92nd Streetwide for having us and for underwriting this event. So we are at a troubling watershed moment for K-12 public education in the U.S. The dismantling of the Department of Ed, as Jeff has already mentioned, will result in a disruption that will have profound negative effects on millions of students, especially low-income and at-risk students in schools that receive Title I and IDA special education revenues. Together, these two programs amount to about $30 billion, or about 60% of the total federal education budget. It is not completely clear how these revenues might be either eliminated or reallocated in block grants or other new programs to states, and not to mention the legal challenges that will also ensue. It's important to remember that the total amount of Fed contributions in state ed budgets is only about 12 to 13%, but the profound effects of losing that portion of revenues on these very vulnerable populations is incalculable at the moment. Coupled with the potential loss of revenues, of the federal revenues, the Fed is also wading again into pushing for an increase in privatization through either a voucher or tax credit scholarship scheme that is estimated to cost up to about $10 billion a year. It's being billed as the Educational Choice for Children Act, a voucher scheme that mimics existing tax credit scholarships where individual corporations are allowed to donate a portion of tax liability to scholarship granting organizations in exchange for reducing their tax liability, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. Eligibility would be pegged to families earning up to about 300% of the median income in their region, which is well into the middle class band. And the act explicitly prohibits public accountability measures of private schools and in effect redirects federal funding away from other crucial government services towards wealthy individuals and families. While the underlying goals for many private school choice proponents has been universal eligibility, this has not changed since the earliest efforts to enact vouchers. But the political context surrounding such policies has changed in response to recent issues that arose during COVID-19. In the context of politically polarizing culture wars over vaccines, mandates, and curriculums, choice advocates have now increasingly emphasized parental rights in contrast to early periods in which choice was often framed politically as a means for expanding educational opportunities to those students that were most in need. In addition, by prohibiting state education departments from engaging in due diligence and oversight of private schools, vouchers and tuition tax credit programs threaten public authority and the ability of states to ensure a uniform education system that advances equity, social cohesion, and democratic citizenship. U.S. citizens rely on public schools to teach students to participate in the democratic processes, engage in public discourse, and respect divergent viewpoints. Vouchers and tax credit subsidies for private school tuition may encourage families to separate themselves into school communities with competing value systems. Thus, these programs contest the common school model, and they shift attention away from the established public goals such as citizenship training and workforce preparation. These tenets are echoed in Brown v. Board of Education, where the court stated that education is important to our democratic society and it is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, and it's the foundation of good citizenship.
Thank you. You're on.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a privilege to be at the 92nd Street Y and back on the Upper East Side, where for many years, starting in 2002, my mornings followed a predictable pattern. I dropped my daughter off at the Brearley School, just a few blocks from here, one of the best schools in New York City. Then I would get back on the subway, and I would go 3 more subway stops to PS 277 on 147th Street in the South Bronx, where I was a 5th grade teacher. Now, in 2002, the South Bronx, District 7, was New York's lowest scoring school district. And my school, PS 277, well, it was the lowest scoring school in District 7. So day after day, I saw the very best and worst of American education up close. Now, mind you, there were no charter schools in the South Bronx back then. Where you lived determined where you went to school. So why charter schools? Why school choice? Well, first, they work. Studies from Stanford University show that urban charter school networks in places like New York City outperform district schools for low-income kids of color, closing achievement gaps. Second, and I think more importantly, it's about fairness. It's about equity. Think of it. As a well-off white parent, I could take my daughter out of public school, put her in Brearley without anyone raising an eyebrow. It was uncontroversial. But when a low-income black or brown parent in the South Bronx wants the same or similar freedom, well, now we have to debate it in forums like this one. No child is a public resource to be hoarded by a system. If I got that choice, they should too. Anything less is indefensible. That's not just un-American. Dare I say it's racist. Now, you will hear studies, I'm sure, that will say that competition improves outcomes. It makes schools and teachers work harder. Frankly, I'm agnostic. When I taught at PS 277, I could not have worked harder. And I'm not anti-public school. Frankly, I don't even think of myself as a school choice advocate first and foremost. My stance is quite simple. The public's interest is in a child getting a good education. Public, private, charter, homeschool. I'm not concerned with whose roof kids are educated under. I'm more concerned about what happens under that roof. All of them need to be excellent. A good school opens doors of opportunity for kids. A bad one narrows their horizons. So let's fast forward 25 years. Today in the South Bronx, charter schools have opened in the very same neighborhood where I used to teach. Not long ago, I spent a year embedded in one such school, Success Academy Charter School, literally across the street from where I'd been a student teacher and in the same neighborhood where I taught 5th grade. That Success Academy is one of the top 10 elementary schools in the state. And PS 277, well, despite spending $40,000 per child every year, it is still today the lowest scoring school in the lowest scoring district in the city of New York. Another lost generation. So if we have one segment of society free to pursue educational excellence, while we seek to deny it to another segment of society, that does not promote equity or equality. It promotes oligarchy. It breeds aristocracy. It practically demands it. So why do I favor charters and choice? Well, that's why. I simply want the children that I served to have what I had, every conceivable opportunity.
Thank you. Next round. Each of you has 2 minutes to rebut, if I can put it that way, one of the points that your colleague or opponent has made. Professor Huerta?
Sure. Not so much a rebuttal, but just a sort of reflection on some of your points. And I think that one of the most important pieces that has been understudied in the research around school choice is the process of devolving public authority to local actors and how that potentially erodes the power of the state. Myself and colleagues and others have written about this as one of the paradoxes of what happens when you decentralize public authority. I think early in the choice movement, starting in 1990 and 91, when vouchers and then charters started thereafter, often there was this seductive sell of promoting choice, not just as an approach to sort of empowering parents to develop their own school communities and creating new schools, but also to participate in a market-driven system that was going to breed competition. 30-some years later in this history of the very contemporary choice mechanism, there's been very little evidence that that's the case. And there's been a lot written about whether the devolving of this public authority has also eroded the power of the state to equalize as we either provide more monies to charter schools and or in the form of giving monies to private schools through private subsidies. This is still a balance that I think that we are sort of trying to figure out. But I do think that it's something that we still have to fully account for, and especially given in the current context where we begin to see the eroding of the state insofar as eliminating the entire Department of Education.
You got a couple of minutes on your own to...
Thanks. For what it's worth, I study curriculum, instruction, practice. I'm the odd ed policy person who does not spend my time worrying that much about the Department of Education. But that said, let me correct what I think might be a misperception. If the Department of Education goes away, and I'm agnostic on that as well, I haven't heard any serious discussion that it places at risk things like Title I funding, which as an urban educator I take quite seriously. I'd be very concerned if it did. Most of those things are mandated by Congress. Title I, IDEA, civil rights issues. Those would almost certainly go someplace else, to HHS, to the Justice Department. I'm not championing the Department of Education, nor will I shed any bitter tears if it disappears, because I don't think those things are at risk. The word education famously does not appear in the U.S. Constitution. It's not one of the enumerated powers. Therefore, it belongs to the state. But the question, and I think maybe I might be taking your side somewhat on this, even though I'm a choice person, I'm less concerned about the state than I am about the quality of education. For years in ed reform convenings, I would be the guy asking my colleagues, like, wait a minute, you want to hold them accountable? You assume that teachers and schools know what to do and we just need to hold them accountable. Where did you get that idea? Because I'm not seeing that level of expertise. And now I find myself saying something similar to my choice friends, which is you have this idea that there's all this dynamism out there that is just waiting to be set free from union domination or the powers of central authorities. Where'd you get that idea? Because I'm not seeing that level of talent. So I say this is to say that is my concern and why I'm agnostic on the platform here. Whether it's public, charter, homeschooling, we have an excellence crisis right now. We simply need to provide better education. That's my concern. Again, at the risk of repeating myself, the roof under which that happens is a secondary concern.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions for each of you, and feel free to extend this. This is not like a meet the press. You can talk to each other. Let me start with a personal account, Professor Huerta. My daughter was a real advocate for public schools. Grew up here in New York, had resources, but put her son in a public school where he was flourishing. Then COVID hit. And the longer the schools kept closed and turned to virtual teaching, the worse things were for my grandson. It was literally jeopardizing his entire educational future. And as we've seen from some recent scores, this is not an isolated incident. My daughter had the resources, perhaps I should say the family had the resources, to take my grandson, put him in a private school where he flourished. Why shouldn't lower income people, faced with a public school that, for whatever reasons, ideological, political, the power of the union, whatever it is, just kept those schools shut, why shouldn't they have the chance to say, I need to save my kid too?
So from the perspective as a researcher, I too am agnostic about whether or not that should happen. As a citizen, I am concerned that using taxpayers' money to go to a private school, which has zero accountability of public dollars, is something that is simply antithetical to how we use public resources. You use the COVID-19 example, which I'm struck by. And COVID-19 is an example that sort of buttresses up against my previous idea of the role of the state as being the great equalizer. During the COVID pandemic, if we had not developed the vaccine together with private companies and then distributed and so forth, that was an example of the state working and to be the great equalizer during times of crisis. I still think that with 90% of our children in public schools, eroding the power of the state to provide those services to the majority, the 90% of students who are in public schools, should be our focus, with public accountability.
Go ahead.
Sure. The choice is a theory of accountability, right? In other words, if you want to argue that we need to hold schools accountable for performance, fine. That said, what has accountability done? I mean, we've, like the story I just told about my old school, in 30 years it has been held accountable and is exactly in the same position. So what exactly is the argument for accountability when there are examples like that? The theory undergirding choice is it's literally a different theory of accountability. Instead of the state or school districts holding schools accountable, the theory is, well, let's let the people with the most skin in the game hold the school accountable, the parents. Given that front row seat that I just described, who's going to have a better lens on the quality of the school? The distant district authority, the person looking at the test scores, or mom and dad who are seeing the quality of instruction day after day and may vote with their feet long before the state takes action?
Well, I'm glad you asked, as they say on 60 Minutes. There's a place in Texas called Vallejo. Has public charter schools. 1,000 students. The superintendent of that district last year was paid $870,000. And the board, apparently, if the story is correct, basically met for the purpose of continuing to fund this guy's bonuses, as well as so for the parents of those 1,000 students, the fact that there is at least, ostensible accountability, and I may be wrong about this, I'll get back to this, I'm not sure that particular kind of corruption, if that's what it is, would happen in a public school. I don't know, but that certainly suggests that parents in this situation, and I've got a couple of others I want to ask you about, don't have that accountability. That in fact, because a lot of these private schools are not required to explain themselves.
Well, if that's a charter school, then that's a public accountability issue, because charter schools are public schools and there are they are publicly accountable.
Okay, so let me just briefly get to this other example.
Sure.
This is a piece that ProPublica just put out about Arizona. Of all of the choices, it seems to me the most bold or radical are these savings accounts, where the state gives parents money. Mm-hmm. They can use that money for, depending on the state, but in Arizona, anything. In that state, they can get tutors, they can teach their kids how to kick a field goal to get into college. And as it turns out, this program has been so funded, it's in the thousands of dollars and maybe harder, that program has been deemed the principal reason why Arizona has a huge budget cap deficit. So it does strike me that, that particular kind of choice with no means test, you can use that money to pay $20,000 of, there's no guardrail against any number of kind of abuses in that kind of system.
Yeah. Boy, you've thrown a lot of things out there. Let me try to remember all the points I want to raise. First, on means testing, This is an argument that, frankly, we hear on the political right. Well, some of my choice colleagues say, well, we should means test. What you're describing is called an ESA, an education savings account, which basically allows the parent to opt out of the public school system and take with him or her the lion's share of the money that would otherwise have been spent on their child's public education to pay for their own, whether it's tutors, et cetera. We don't means test public education. Why would you means test an ESA? These mechanisms are not changing who's eligible for a public education. They're changing who's eligible to provide one. Funny story about Arizona. I was out there a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, reporting on exactly some of these phenomenon. And there was a story that appeared at the time that was criticizing ESA parents for spending money on, I think it was kayaks, trampolines, and trips to SeaWorld. And people's hair were on fire about this. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, when I was at PS 277, I took my kids to Club Getaway, every spring as a reward after the which is an outdoor adventure park up in Connecticut. We had trampolines, we had gym equipment. Why is it different? In other words, and on the issue of the Texas school and its accountability, I'm not going to apologize or make excuses for, are they hiring if they're paying $800,000 for folks? I'd like one of those jobs. But for every story like that, there is the story of an elementary school in cities like ours where not one kid is reading on grade level or doing math on grade level. Where are the stories about those children and those schools?
And that's what I wanted to turn to you about. You can add to my answer.
I wanted to just reply on the need for means tests. And I want to put this in context of when we talk about school choice, whether it's charters or primarily vouchers as well, where we see this happening in the privatization realm, is that school choice is often promoted as an idea that parents are empowered and they are the ones making the choices. When in fact, we know that, especially when it comes to vouchers and the education savings accounts where money is flowing to private schools, is that the schools are making the choice. The schools have the absolute power to choose any student in a private school context. We see some selection also in charter schools when we see private schools where privates or students don't make it into the lottery hopper unless parents have attended 2 meetings or 3 meetings during the middle of the day, when many parents can't do that. So there's some self-selection already there happening in the type of parents that those schools are selecting. But when we account for school choice and who's actually making the choices, we have to remind ourselves also that, again, 90% of our kids are still in public schools. The idea of seeing these millions of dollars flow to private schools with zero accountability is problematic. It's a scarce resource. And we need to put we need to continue to keep those resources where the majority of our children are.
But please.
I'd love to make a point about schools choosing, private schools choosing the parents and the students, as it were. Maybe because I spend my time focusing on curriculum and instruction, I seem to be the only one who makes this argument. Well, public schools choose too. They choose curriculum, they choose pedagogy, they choose discipline procedures and whatnot. I'm not sure if you've listened to a podcast that's made quite a lot of waves in the last couple of years called Sold a Story by Emily Hanford of American Public Media. It's literally changing the way we teach reading in this country. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it. One of the bad guys, as it were, the villains of this story is a woman named Lucy Calkins, who has run a literacy program that dominated New York City schools for a quarter century or more. That was the literacy program in my school. You could talk to some of my grad students from back then. So when they listen to Sold a Story, they're like, hey, Pondiscio, you were talking about this 20 years ago. Yeah, we knew this was a terrible pedagogy. We knew that this was not helping our low-income kids learn how to read. But the school chose it. The parents were stuck with it.
Can I interrupt to ask you something? Louisiana, which was the 50th in the nation in reading, has had something of a miraculous rise to 16th.
Remarkable rise.
And the state incentivizes schools to use a particularly different kind of reading, not hers.
They don't impose a specific curriculum, but they are using curriculum as a driver of their reform.
So my question is, if in fact this particular program works, can and should a state require this program even in private schools, or is that an overreach of the government?
Well, one of the other aspects of choice that goes unmentioned, and I'm going to fault some of my fellow choice advocates for this. We tend to beat up on public schools, and when a public school is underperforming, we use that as a cudgel to say, hey, look, that public school is terrible, demand choice. That is not an argument that I agree with or even care to make. Again, once you look at the incredible variety of what choice makes possible, your local school might be great, but maybe you'd like a classical school or a project-based learning school. Maybe your child would thrive in a micro school. The public school system is hard-pressed to do that, or frankly, to impose it. If my school decided they wanted a classical curriculum, well, what about the kids who don't want that? They want something else. Choice. So the analogy I like to use is with restaurants. Like, you might like Italian food, you might like Mexican, I might like a French bistro. Oh, but wait a minute, but what about the state-run restaurant? We can't disadvantage them. Okay, well, what do they serve in the state restaurant? Food. Wait, what kind of food? No, food, just food.
No, I'm thinking of my experience in the public school cafeterias, which is not, necessarily an endorsement. But this point really intrigues me, because the idea that you might choose a school less for the reading scores or the math scores and more for the cultural climate, because part of, I think, the romance, if that's the right word, of public schools was we would take all these people from different places, different stature, and teach them a kind of common American notion. I think that may be one of the things that John Dewey was.
Horace Mann.
Horace Mann. Well, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I want to dispel the notion. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, but the question is, do you believe that argument is one of the reasons why school choice is a bad choice? That seeking out silos of different education may not be the healthiest thing for the country?
So I want to dispel the notion that somehow public schools are all the same. I mean, we have enormous variety in public schools. In fact, we have 3,700 charter schools now nationwide that do serve or do provide a variety of different programs. Over time, I have been a critic of this, is that the accountability structures that do exist sometimes force them to appear or to behave like most traditional schools. But we know that most of the effective public schools today are those schools that are providing a different variety and are doing something that is specific to the needs and demands of parents in their local community, which is very much the charter school idea. So sure, we have standards and other things, but that doesn't mean that every school in the public context is a cookie cutter school. We have great variety among those schools. Just like we have the same sort of variety in private schools, but there's no evidence to show that in private schools we somehow have a panoply of all these different schools.
I just want to get a footnote clarification. Would this suggest that you are much less worried about charter schools than you are about school vouchers and savings accounts?
From a research perspective, we know that some charters now, after 30-some years, have shown to actually prove to increase the achievement scores of their students. And we see that mostly in a lot of the so-called no excuses schools. But some of the research on this is still mixed, because none of these studies that we've done engaged on charter schools are randomized control, but rather they are sort of lottery studies where there's 500 kids that are in the hopper, 250 of them were accepted, 250 are not, and then we follow both of those schools. So on that point, though, we're already working with a self-selected group of parents who have attempted to enter that school, which is very distinct than many of the other parents who are still left behind and never even tried to enter the school from the first place.
Robert, if I may,
Please.
It seems to me that underlying this argument that both sides might have an agenda, and some agendas are worse than others. I think it is true that shortly after Brown versus Board of Education, all kinds of private academies sprung up in the South. And the reason they sprung up in the South was the parents didn't want to send their kids to integrated schools. I don't know that that's still a factor. It may well be. But the broader question is, I do have the sense that some proponents of choice, their agenda is they just don't like government. The head of the publisher of the Arizona newspaper, Dan Quayle's father-in-law or something, he wouldn't even call them public schools. He called them government schools. Yeah. And I wonder if it's reasonable to say that for, at least for some of the people on the school choice side, they just don't like public stuff.
It may be, and I'm not avoiding your question, but having engaged in these debates for the better part of 25 years now, for every claim like that, there's always an equal and opposite claim. In other words, why are we so opposed to choice when we have schools that have failed children for generations? Okay, if you were sitting here with Randy Weingarten or Becky Pringle, they would give you lots of reasons. They're the head of the local or the national teachers unions. But isn't their agenda about protecting jobs, for example? So, I'm not trying to avoid your question, but we can go around in circles all day. As somebody who is a choice proponent, one of the first things you have to do if you're an honest choice proponent is recognize that sometimes people will choose things that either you would not choose or you will not like their rationale for that choice. But the larger question as a public policy matter is how are we going to get better results for more children? Is it with the system that we have or by democratizing, as it were, who is able to provide a public education?
Here's the flip side of this, Professor Huerta. And I speak as the son of a public school librarian who was joined the teachers union before it was called the teachers union, before Albert Shanker. This is how far back we go. But there's a sense in which there's a political agenda behind a lot of the unions. You may or may not know this, if you go to a Democratic convention, the most frequent job held by a delegate is a public school teacher. Sure. And there seems to me there have been places, like Chicago being perhaps the most dramatic example, where basically the teachers union elected the mayor, who, unsurprisingly, endorsed virtually all of their demands, some of which were ambitious. So if there's a problem with taking kids out of the public school, we lose something. Isn't there something to be concerned about that a heavily unionized public school system may be carrying, deliberately or not, a political agenda along with what it's teaching?
I would challenge the question. And I don't think that the political agenda of teachers' unions is in any way somehow some secret. It's a very public agenda insofar as trying to protect teachers, trying to increase the quality of teachers, making sure that we have teachers for 90% of our kids that go to public schools. Granted, the teachers' union is a very powerful lobby, as with many other lobbies. But I don't think they have a stranglehold on the state budgets or the small portion of federal budgets that actually reach states.
In this state, there has been a charter school cap for the better part of a decade, and I think the sun will go out before that cap is lifted, despite the fact that here in New York City, as you yourself said, some of our highest performing schools are charter schools. So I don't think I'm wrong to say that that's the hand of the unions in large measure to keep that charter cap in place. But if we cared about kids, if we cared about outcomes, if we were treating those charter schools as Albert Shanker said, as engines of innovation to learn from in the broader K-12 world, well, that cap would not be there.
I wanted to ask this at the risk of chaos, but maybe not, because there may be slightly more agreement on some stuff than I thought. Do either of you, or can both of you point to studies about the impact of choice that you say, yeah, they're right about that? Or are the studies so diffuse that you can sort of pick whichever study you want to prove your point?
So just for example, over the last 5 years around voucher programs, we've seen some very interesting studies in Louisiana, Ohio, Indiana, where we're actually beginning to see some blanket negative effects on students. And that is students who exited public schools and used a voucher to go to a private school. We're seeing that they are actually scoring worse than they predicted would have if they actually remained in a public school. Prior to that, there's been a lot of controversy on the so-called gold standard of some of the voucher studies in the past that had some level of randomized control, but very isolated effects, but which proponents use to draw claims that vouchers, were the next thing that was going to close the achievement gap and so forth, when that's not the case. But the research is fairly robust these days. In fact, we have over 30 years of research on vouchers, and it's becoming a bit more definitive, not just methodologically, but also with some of the results. And I already talked about some of the charter stuff. Then There's some interesting research, but we still lack a randomized control study in charter schools.
Before you respond, I wonder if there may be a common ground here. The education department has apparently more or less wiped out the funds for educational testing. Is this something that should concern
Oh,
us?
sure, it's a concern. But that said, we've had 50 years of NAEP testing. That's what they call the nation's report card, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And my rueful joke is it looks like a dead man's EKG. I mean, it hasn't budged for 50 years. So whether the research exists or does not exist, we're not very good at using it to improve our practice.
And that's the point that you made in one of your, I think, recent articles, that, and you've alluded to it a couple of times, that this whole argument, I don't want to say it's misplaced, but where you want the argument is we've got to actually learn what kids learn from.
How to deliver education more successfully.
And so when I mentioned that result of Louisiana, it was a similar result apparently in Mississippi. Yep. Neither of those two states were necessarily regarded as educational gold standards, but they seem to have...
They are improving dramatically in the last couple of cycles of NAEP, both Mississippi and Louisiana. At the risk of sounding glib, I'm not necessarily persuaded, I'm not unpersuaded by the voucher studies. They're not good news if you're a choice proponent, but it's a bit like studying the auto industry in 1890. And saying, well, the studies show the horse and buggy is more effective. In other words, there's a theory of change at work here, which is that, hey, look, we have invested, and despite the fact that we've, tripled education spending over the last, 30 or 40 years, we're still, there's that dead man's EKG of NAEP. So in other words, it can't be spending, we're spending more and more, and we're not getting the results. We need to try something different. So the promise of vouchers or school choice is it invites new entrants into the market. And I hate discussing education and using the word market because that's not why we send our children to school. But the simple fact of the matter is we are not delivering a quality product for kids. And if somebody can come along and figure out a way to do that better than we have in the public system for the last 50 or 75 years, then attention must be paid.
A quick reply. You reminded me of another study using NAEP. NAEP is our national report card, as Robert just reminded us. And this is a study by colleagues at University of Indiana that studied NAEP and actually looked at the differences between public charter school kids, charter public school kids, and voucher kids. And when they used some of the indicators that had already, some of the legacy indicators that had already been collected in NAEP for over 20 years, and were able to create composite variables that accounted for how much time families were spending with children outside of schools, they were able to show that there was no discernible difference between private schools and public schools. And there was only a minor difference in public charter schools that scored just slightly higher. The reason I point this out is because NAEP assesses both public and private school kids. And it's one of those assessments that allows us to see that what is happening in private schools isn't any better necessarily than what's happening in public schools. So this idea of seeking some sort of better opportunity through those sort of private schools, when opportunity may actually be in some of the public schools.
And to wrap this up before we turn to the audience questions, what it strikes me is that with all of this ambiguity, a lot of the proponents on either side sort of retreat to their original stations, and that what we're reciting are the broadest notion of these arguments rather than hardcore facts about what's going on.
Look, I'll make an argument for Professor Huerta, which is given the permission structures that exist in charters in private schools, they should be better, right? I think this is why I spend so much of my time focusing on curriculum and instruction. I'm not a public school basher. I'm not necessarily a private school. I don't beat the drums for them. I'm interested in a quality outcome for every child. So sure, the permission structure that we create with these various mechanisms raises the bar for choice proponents. If you're going to create these mechanisms and let everybody choose their own adventure, well, it damn well better be good.
Let me turn to the audience's questions. And obviously, this is one that comes up, and I'm glad, as they say, I'm glad somebody asked the question because I should have. Given the principle of separation of church and state, should taxpayer dollars be used to fund religious schools through vouchers and school choice programs, or should public funds remain dedicated to a secular education? And I believe the Supreme Court is very soon going to rule on a case that is going to vastly expand the power of parents to use money in much more specifically religious ways than it has been so far.
If religious schools want to take advantage of that mechanism, a lot of them don't want the public dollars.
But fair enough. But to the broader point.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, and that is a great question because it raises a point I wanted to raise earlier. I got shockingly far into this line of work before I realized that the way we practice public education in this country is not the norm in the rest of the world. If you would ask me, hey, the way we do it here, the government funds and the government runs schools, that's pretty much the standard everywhere, right? No. There's a woman named Ashley Berner at Johns Hopkins University who's written a ton about educational pluralism, and it turns out that we're the outlier. In most other countries, especially high-performing countries, the government tends to fund, but not necessarily run, schools. So I believe from memory in the Netherlands, there are 54 different types of schools, public, private, religious, et cetera, all getting government funding. So if we go down this route, this will actually bring the United States in alignment with the way it's practiced in most other countries.
So to answer that question directly, the answer is no. And just to also talk about, so comparison studies to other national places, yes, in the Netherlands and other countries that have vouchers and similar type programs, they also have accountability for many of the private schools. And that's shared, it's the same shared accountability that exists for public schools if those public monies are going to flow to those schools. And there's also guarantees that these private schools will accept kids in a similar fashion that public schools do. And that's a very important distinction.
I'm going to tack on something to this question. Why isn't the goal to improve and make accessible excellent public schools, as opposed, I guess, to diverting tax funds in the sense of giving it to parents? Now, maybe part of the answer, maybe we don't know how to do that, but I want to start with you, Professor Huerta, because it does seem to me, I remember in 2000, I was moderating a debate between Bill Bradley and Al Gore. And one of the questions at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, to locate it, and one of the points that I asked was, since 1965, when federal aid to education began, I don't remember what the number was, but it was a vast amount of money for no particular results. And I would argue, not as eloquently as you would, that one of the reasons why charter schools became an issue, I think originally in poorer neighborhoods, was the parents were desperate to get their kids out of these schools. So I guess what I'm asking is, maybe we don't know what to do with all that money if it only went to public. Maybe diverting it to competitive schools will give us a better sense of what works.
So one of the areas I think where Rob's and I sort of may agree and intersect here is in the role of accountability. As I'm a strong proponent of accountability for public dollars. However, I also, as somebody who has studied this for many years in the context of decentralization in charter schools, is that while charter schools were allowed a wide latitude and permission to experiment with how they use resources, hiring teachers, instructional days, instructional minutes, whatever it might be in the early days, over time, they actually became to appear more and more like traditional schools, even in states where that level of latitude was still permitted for them. Now, there was a movement of re-centralizing and recapturing and applying the same rules to charters that actually happened at the same time. But there are still many states that allow a wide level of latitude to charter schools, yet the charter school operators still seem to operate and mimic very traditional approaches to schooling. The schools that I have seen that are making a difference are the ones who use that wiggle room, so to speak, to engage in different innovations and how they use their resources, how they train their teachers, how they allocate time, professional development, and a lot of other things. These are things that are common stake in every school, but they're doing it differently. And that's where we're seeing some distinctions, and in some of the work that Rob has done, that has actually led to actually achievement gains. But whether that's replicable, whether that's scalable to a different level, that's another question.
I guess I'm hung up on the point that there's so much variety or potential variety in school that, look, I agree with you, although maybe not for the same reason. There's no such thing as a garden variety basic school. Every school is different, whether it's values, curriculum, instructional strategies, et cetera. And once you see that school for what it is, where adults are making decisions on behalf of children that their parents may or may not agree with, then all roads almost inevitably lead to choice. Who am I to impose? I may like a classical curriculum. If I'm the principal of a public school, do I have the wherewithal to impose that curriculum on people who didn't choose it? Should I have that?
The wherewithal or the political power?
Well, in other words, there's so many different approaches to teaching reading, teaching math, to the values in a school. I mean, there's no such thing as a values-neutral school. Everything from, do you stress holding the door open, saying please and thank you to the lunch ladies? Do you call the teacher Miss Jones or Nancy? I mean, there's so many moving parts there that once you start to see the immense complexity of what schools do and that they are not values-neutral, then you almost have to allow choice, because otherwise you're imposing your choices on people who may have chosen something different given the opportunity.
I want to tell you a political story or fact that goes back even longer than I've been here at the Y. I spent the last year of his life working for Robert Kennedy. And one of the things he said often was, he said, the answer to the public school crisis is not more money. We've got to break the structures. He said this was before the Department of Education, they had just started spending federal money, and he said to the head of the Office of Education, why is it the IQ scores of black kids drops between the 3rd and 6th grade? And why is it when I go into the ghetto, one of the things people hate most is the public schools they send their kids to? This is 1967. And in one of his proposals, which I think would have gotten the teachers' unions absolutely in a snit, was he said, maybe somewhere in the junior year in high school, we could introduce vocational stuff. Let the kids leave the classroom a couple hours a week and do jobs. They could earn money for their families. They could learn skills. Now, Newt Gingrich came up with that, but in typical Newt Gingrich form, he said the kids could be janitors. Bobby Kennedy had a somewhat different notion. But I guess what I'm getting at is it's almost like 50 plus years ago, you had not a right-winger looking at the public school systems as they exist and saying these things have to change and there has to be some kind of alternative.
I don't think I can say it any differently than I said it a few moments ago, which is that the public's interest is in the outcome. When a child learns to read, when a child learns to do math, when a child is on his or her way to some independent path in adult life, whether it's in a vocational field, whether it's college, whether it's the military. When a child leaves us at age 17 with a plan and is prepared to follow that path, it's a victory. Nothing in what I just said implies public, private, charter, homeschool. It doesn't matter. What matters is the outcome. What matters is that they leave us at age 17 with a plan, a path, and preparation.
In the idea that government money should follow the students and not the school, how is there any regulation for what happens to the students? Do any of the studies that you know about actually look not so much at schools, but try to focus even on individual students and see what the path to alternative schools meant for them?
Sure. Some of the studies on vouchers have followed individual students, but that's also very difficult to show. And for example, in the Louisiana context that I shared, we know that a lot of students were returning back to public schools. We don't know whether they were the actual kids that were having negative effects, because remember that once students leave public schools and go into private schools, it's very difficult to track them. It's very difficult to know exactly which schools they were going, even if they were attending private schools with a public school subsidy. I want to just speak to the broader issue of just that we need outcomes. I mean, I think that's a given. We're all focused on outcomes. We want all students to succeed. We want our schools to be successful in being able to develop citizens. And where we know that guarantee exists still is in public schools. Despite our shared interest that we want positive outcomes for all students, where we still invest the bulk of our public resources and with account is in the 90% of the kids that attend public schools. I want to continue to believe that as a country that we will not change our focus for a few and mostly wealthy parents who are eligible for subsidy or who are taking advantage of subsidies because they're the ones who are going to be accepted to private schools and not account for the 90% of the kids that are still in public schools.
So before we wrap this up and see whether or not any minds have been changed, are there specific policies that the federal government has adopted over the last decade or two that you think made any difference for good or ill in our schools?
The federal government.
Well, let me be generous, federal or state level.
No, look, I'm a unabashed fan of charter schools. I didn't know what a charter school was when I walked into PS 277 20 odd years ago. In fact, my second year in school, I had to change my classroom because there was a charter school moving into the top floor of the building on 147th and St. Anne's Avenue. And I will never forget what my union chapter leader said when we heard this. She said, well, I'm not opposed to charters, but if we're going to do this for one, we shouldn't, if we can't do it for every child, we shouldn't do it for any child. And I remember laughing in my kind of earnestness, saying that's like saying if we don't have enough lifeboats for every passenger, that everyone's going to drown. Like, why, you wouldn't think that way. Why would you be opposed to creating these kind of opportunities? So yeah, that's my answer is the various charter school laws that have been created since about 1991 across the country.
So I am a supporter that the federal government has provided grants for almost 30 years now to the charter school system, and that it states that there is some level of account to some charters, and we're still struggling with some of that level of accountability. But to answer your question directly, I think it's the continued, it's not a new policy, but it's the continued funding of Title I and the continued funding of special ed that I think is the most important role of the Fed, and that is that the majority of the Fed education budget is in those two buckets. And also allowing for some of those monies to be used with more discretion at the state level, both for Title I and for special ed.
I just wish we had more to show for it.
I don't remember his name, but you will. Were either or both of you fans of Obama's education secretary, who was
Which one?
Touched the nerve here.
Arnie Duncan and John King.
Arnie Duncan, who supposedly, riled the teachers' unions a bit by suggesting alternatives. But now what?
John King is a very good man.
That's like saying, do you love me? And the answer is, you're a very nice person.
No, that's me avoiding the question.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
So I was
an argumentative approval or denial.
I was a fan of Obama and Duncan's race to the top sort of policy, where they put out priorities. And now this was also happening after 2008, when there was a doubling of the federal budget.
I have to say, there's something else going on here.
As a curriculum and instruction guy, I was, strike me dead, I was a fan of Common Core, not because I love standards, but because it created a mechanism to put curriculum at the center of education reform, and I hold Arnie Duncan responsible for basically strangling that effort by imposing it on states, as opposed to letting them find their way to the...
That wasn't so hard.
It was hard.
Okay. So it is time to see whether minds have changed. It is time for the audience here, using that device that I never have understood, for folks at home using their phones, to reply again to the question, as we look at education, should we be moving toward more parental choice in the form of vouchers or charter schools? We're going to give you some time. And in this section, you actually have done this a little bit, but was any point that your counterpart made in his presentation something that you went, all right, there's something to that, I want to deal with it?
Sure, but that said, and this is not in any way to be disrespectful to Professor Huerta, it was an argument that I was persuaded of when I walked in, which is I am concerned about social cohesion. I worry what happens. I mean, let's be candid. The Horace Mann ideal of public schools, what did he call it? The balance wheel of democracy or some such. It's a lovely notion. It just hasn't worked out. But I worry not what happens when we lose public schools, but when we lose that ideal, when we lose this idea that, hey, I'm an unrepentant disciple of a guy named E.D. Hirsch Jr., who wrote Cultural Literacy. His work has shaped my career. His idea that there is a common body of knowledge that we need, not just to be good citizens, although that's important, but to be literate Americans. That's the way language proficiency works. So I do worry in a choose-your-own-adventure system that we will take that too literally and lose touch with, if not the common school ideal, this idea that there is a shared body of knowledge that we all need to possess to be literate Americans and fully engaged citizens.
And do you have, just to follow, do you have any sense that work is proceeding at a better pace in charter schools and in public schools and private schools? I mean, because in one sense, if you go to a highly elite private school, where there may be a couple of scholarship kids, the idea of social cohesion would be a little hard to come by, no?
Probably, yeah, but they're also part of what Hirsch would call the dominant language community. So in other words, the kids that I taught at PS 277, they did not have, put aside their school, they didn't have the benefit in many instances of parents who were themselves college educated, who engaged them in rich literate talk at the dinner table. They may have been second language learners and whatnot. In other words, the most language rich environment that they were in was their public school. So I don't want to suggest that this is not something that has to be worried about in private schools, but very often affluent kids come to school with rich vocabularies, with a lot of background knowledge, et cetera. So it's just not a front and center concern for the Brearleys, the Spences, and the collegiates.
And then we'll turn to but go ahead.
I appreciate Robert's very enthusiastic support of choice. I really, and I know this is also, and I appreciate how this is so grounded in their experiences and having been embedded in the book that you wrote around one of the charter schools here in New York City. As I indicated at the beginning, I'm agnostic on choice as a researcher. I have to be. But I also know what the results are, and we see mostly negative and very small increases in students' learning curves. And as a citizen, I'm enthusiastic about the idea that there are a variety of schools. And choice is a necessary mechanism, and it's here to stay. So I was struck by some of the elements of what you shared about your enthusiasm and supporting that, and whatever that means for the choice mechanism, for the choice movement that goes forth. I think it's only going to be of value to them, but I will remain a skeptic of losing public accountability as dollars flow to private choice programs in the form of vouchers and others.
Well, these aren't exit polls. These are real numbers. And let's turn to them. So the question that we asked was, is parental school choice, including vouchers and charters, an important part of education in America?
Yes.
The audience began tilting heavily toward the yes. 62% said yes, 38% no. After the margin shrank just a bit. 58% said yes, 42% said no. So I don't know, I did a lot of political journalism, and there's a temptation to take any number and extrapolate it into, what it seems to me to say is, it was a moderate shift. But what I want to say is that what I learned tonight, apart from education, is that the CEO of the Y is onto something, Seth Lipsky. I mean, for me, this was an absolute model of civil disagreement. Of making the points, okay, you've got a point, but what about this? This was no descent into what pollutes the social media and the cable networks. And I think we owe these gentlemen a real debt of gratitude for being here.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay. And on that note, good night, and remember, this is a school night.
Oh, yeah.